Did you know that 8% of the world's population holds 85% of the world's wealth? The average American has over $38,000 in personal debt. In 2019, the average annual salary in the United States was $56,000. Around 23% of Americans have no emergency savings. More than half of American workers live paycheck to paycheck. The average credit card debt in the U.S. is around $5,000 per person. Only 24% of millennials demonstrate basic financial literacy. Over 44 million Americans have student loan debt, totaling more than $1.7 trillion. The top 1% of the world's population owns more wealth than the other 99% combined. In the U.S., the average mortgage debt is over $200,000. Around 55% of Americans have less than $10,000 saved for retirement. Over 40% of Americans cannot afford a $400 emergency expense. The global debt reached a staggering $253 trillion in 2019. Over 7 million Americans are currently delinquent on their auto loans. Around 37% of Americans have credit card debt that they cannot pay off each month. The U.S. has the highest healthcare costs in the world. The average American spends over $18,000 on healthcare annually. Since 1948, the S&P 500 has delivered an average annual return of around 10%. Over 50% of small businesses fail within their first 5 years. Credit card debt in the U.S. reached a record high of $930 billion in 2020. Around 62% of Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. Americans spend around $1.2 trillion on non-essential items each year. The average American household has over $7,000 in revolving credit card debt. More than 55% of Americans have less than 3 months' worth of expenses saved. The average cost of a wedding in the U.S. is over $30,000. Over 40% of Americans have no retirement savings at all. The cost of college tuition in the U.S. has increased by over 200% in the past 20 years. Around 25% of adults in America have no credit score or credit history. Over 90% of Americans use digital banking services. The average American spends over $1,000 on coffee each year. Around 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Over 30% of Americans have no savings account. The average annual cost of owning a car in the U.S. is over $9,000. Over 40% of Americans carry credit card debt for more than 2 years. Around 35% of Americans have been contacted by a debt collector. The average American has a credit card balance of over $6,000. Over 50% of Americans have less than 1 month's worth of expenses saved. The average American spends over $5,000 on dining out each year. Around 82% of Americans have some form of debt. Over 25% of Americans have no savings at all. The U.S. national debt surpassed $27 trillion in 2020. Only 41% of Americans have a budget.